Chapter 10. Return to Golespon. In the early hours of the next day, 3 harpies could be seen flying at a fairly decent pace towards the north of the dukedom. Since he knew the area, Reyes was the one leading the way. His 2 bodyguards, Quinnigoff and Tenegi, were with him, following close behind and keeping a careful eye on everything that was happening about them. Both of the huntresses were only carrying their dart throwers with them. They had left their spears behind at the village at Reyes' insistence. I don't want to be conspicuous. Those spears will make us stand out far too much. It wasn't the best weather for flying. The snow that had started to fall early the previous day had gotten steadily worse in the last 24 hours. The snow still wasn't settling, but the ground was covered in a thin layer of white as each snowflake rested for a moment before it melted. Reyes and his 2 bodyguards were effectively flying through a gentle blizzard. This weather is likely to get worse before it gets better, Tenegi said. I think the snow could be enchanted, Reyes suggested. Enchanted, my chief? Quinnigoff asked. Yes, Reyes said. It's too well timed. It started shortly after the country fell to the elves and the goblins. It's almost as if someone's trying to stop anyone from fleeing the country. With this little bit of snow, boss? Tenegi asked. Well, no, Reyes admitted. I don't think this would stop anyone, but it has been getting steadily worse. I'm not sure, boss, Tenegi commented. The worst to be hit would be us harpies, as too much snow would ground us. If things get really bad, it would cripple the elves as well. She's right, my chief, Quinnigoff argued. Bad weather would be as detrimental for the invading forces as for the humans. Maybe even worse. Yeah, Reyes agreed. Still, snow in summer, even if we are at the end of summer. They flew on for the next half hour or so, chatting amicably to each other as they went. The subject of conversation passed through many phases. Part of the time Reyes would sit out of the conversation, and he would fly in relative silence as his 2 bodyguards discussed certain things between them. It was Quinnigoff who broached the subject of protection. We should have brought more huntresses with us, my chief. Reyes was actually surprised to realise he had been addressed. He had been flying lazily over the forest, daydreaming about his love for Gara and how he longed to reach the elven city quickly, so he could conduct his business and get back to her side. What? Quinnigoff repeated the comment. Although Quinnigoff was keeping pace quite easily, she was flying slightly behind and slightly below Reyes, following his lead. This made it difficult for Reyes to actually make eye contact with his bodyguard, since his own shoulders blocked his vision of her when he turned his head. I really don't want us to attract too much attention. I'd still feel more comfortable with 5 or 6 bodyguards, my chief, Quinnigoff voiced. What could be more innocent than 3 young huntresses travelling together? Reyes called back. We look like a normal, everyday hunting party. 5 would also have looked like a hunting party, Quinnigoff told him. Reyes sighed. Quinnigoff was right. He would have gotten away with 4 bodyguards, but he was used to travelling light. In the past it had just been he and Gara. Besides, he still wasn't sure who else among the huntresses of his new village he could really trust. The memory of Magara trying to poison his beloved was still strong in his mind. As he thought about the attempt on Gagara's life, he began to wish that his girlfriend had been well enough to come on this trip with him. Quinnigoff would probably have thrown a fit over both the chief and the leader putting themselves at risk on the same errand. Nevertheless, he would rather have had her company. He had spent most of the previous day with his beloved, and she had certainly recovered a great deal. She seemed to be almost back to her old self. Gagara had spent most of the day sitting up on one of the tables chatting to him. Her appetite had certainly returned, and despite warnings from Mangloss that she should take it easy, Gagara had taken a short walk with him about the ruined courtyard. Just walk for now, Mangloss had insisted. Flying could put too much of a strain on your system. Well, she had flown as well, though it had only been a short flight to answer a necessary call of nature. Indeed, Gagara had seemed to be so healthy when Reyes had left her side last night that he felt he ought to ask the old mage, Are you sure that Gagara won't be fit enough to come on this trip with me? I'm sorry, Mangloss had replied. I'll admit she's recovering quicker than I expected, but she's still very fragile. I don't think a long flight of the kind you intend would be good for her. I prefer to keep an eye on her for at least the next couple of days, and for the sake of your baby, Gagara really needs to stay in my care for at least a week. Reyes had returned to the village for the night, and the moment the sun had risen the following morning, he and both of his daytime bodyguards had begun their journey north. Just remember, Reyes instructed his 2 bodyguards, feeling that it couldn't be repeated too often. As far as anyone in Golespon is concerned, I am not your chief. We are just three capable huntresses hanging out together on some unspecified task for our village. As far as they are to know, I'm not even male." Tanegi swooped down below him for a moment as if she wanted to check for herself. Then she flew up alongside him. "I wish I knew how you did that. How is it possible for someone to change sex? How do you make yourself look female?" "I thought that was obvious," Quinnigoff shouted. From the sound of her voice, she was flying somewhere just above him now. "She's the second coming of Llama Walt." "Ha," Reyes commented dryly. "I wish." It was shortly after Reyes' comment that he noticed a distant line neatly bisecting the countryside. The King's Highway wasn't a straight road. It twisted and turned to allow for the gradient of the land, usually following a path between the small hills that dotted the forest landscape. There were places where it was very wide and very well paved, and others where it became little more than a dirt track. Upon sighting the highway, Reyes began to drift a little more towards it. Soon he was flying directly above the road. It was an empty road. Well, it had never been really busy at the best of times, but as mile after mile of road passed beneath them, Reyes saw no movement whatsoever, not even an elven patrol. There was something almost surreal about it. "We're following the road?" Tanegi asked after a minute or two. "The road will take us all the way to Castle de Moth," Reyes replied. "From there, it's a short hop across the border to Golespon." Reyes led the way along the road at a fair pace, and when the castle came into sight, he ignored it and the branch road that led to it. He did take one glance towards the castle, a wanton desire to see it again. The place had been his home for more than 6 years. He resisted his desire to fly over to it, and continued north over the forest beyond the highway. After about a mile or so they crossed the border, and it was soon passing over land that he recognised from his life in Golespon. He had hunted in these forests with Gagara and his Sisters of the Hope. A little further, and the great walls of the city, still miles away, came visible on the distant horizon. Now that he could see it, Reyes began to fly straight towards the city, losing a little bit of height as the city got steadily closer. A feeling of nostalgia came over to him as he flew over the walls of that city. It might be an evil and oppressive place, and yet it was here that he had first met Gagara. From above, the city looked very familiar, and yet in many ways it was a lot different to how it had been a mere week or so ago. All the streets and buildings looked much as they had back then, but many of the streets of the city seemed almost to be deserted, in comparison to how crowded the city had been. The main thoroughfares, the major roads, and even the small side streets were still bustling with activity. The city was crowded with peasants pushing along to get where they were going, but other than the soldiers in the livery of the city's militia, there was no real military presence. Oh, there was the odd soldier or two wearing uniforms of a different colour, but they were very few in number, and there was nothing like the multicoloured variety of uniforms that had been in the city just a week or so ago. Even the skies above the city seemed somehow empty. The 60 or so harpy villages that had been forced to peacefully coexist in Harpy Town had travelled south with the elven army. The result of this could be seen in the nearby empty skies over Golespon. There were still some harpies in the air, but the sky wasn't filled with them as Reyes remembered. Most of them seemed to be concentrated about Harpy Town, one of the markets, or the arena. The rest of the sky seemed pretty empty, except for the telltale blue glow of the eyes in the sky. "Where are we going, my chief?" Quinnigoff asked. "Don't call me chief," Reyes instructed her, glancing over his shoulder and struggling once again to see her. "We need to head to one of the market districts, to see if there are any shops around that are dedicated to the art of painting." "Painting?" Tanegi said, as if she couldn't believe her ears. "We've flown all this way and put you in potential danger because you want to buy some paint?" "I need a canvas," Reyes told her back. "It's for a very important spell. Like I said, though, it shouldn't take us long. We just need to find the right shop and then we can go home." "Really, boss," Tanegi complained. "You could have just sent a huntress on this errand. You needn't come yourself." Reyes wished his bodyguards wouldn't talk to him in this way. It made him nervous. What if someone were to overhear them? Perhaps it was safe, what with the next nearest airborne harpy close to half the city away, but he would feel a lot better if they didn't keep referring to him as chief or boss. The southernmost market of Golespon was one of the biggest in the city. It was open every day from dawn until a few hours after nightfall. The streets surrounding the main market square were lined with conventional brick and mortar stores, while the roads, and a large central paved square, contained a few hundred smaller stalls and barrows, with only just enough room for their customers to move between them. The market generated a lot of noise as the vendors competed with each other to make themselves heard by the customers. Despite the rest of the city seeming to be relatively empty, the market was just as busy as Reyes remembered. Reyes led the way, landing on the roof of one of the taller shops that surrounded the main square. Tanegi and Quinnigoff took purchase beside him mere moments later. The roof of this shop seemed to be a good vantage point. Reyes felt pretty confident that he could ignore the stalls and barrows. Even if one of them was selling painting materials, he doubted they would be able to sell him anything close to the size of the canvas he'd been sent here to fetch. No, instead, Reyes concentrated on trying to see what the shops that surrounded the main market square had to offer. From previous experience, Reyes knew that all the shops of a certain type tended to be grouped together. All the magic shops in the city could be found sitting next to each other along one street, for example. Somehow, Reyes doubted that there were going to be many shops catering to the budding artists, though. He'd be surprised if there were more than 3 or 4 in the entire city. He just couldn't get his mind around the idea of an elf enjoying the more aesthetic qualities of life, such as art, dance, or music. "Is that the sort of thing you're looking for, my chief?" Quinnigoff asked. She pointed right across the market square, to the row of shops located almost directly opposite. Reyes felt his teeth grate together as she called him chief again. What was the point in making himself look female if she kept referring to him in such a manner? Fortunately, high up on the shop roof, with so much noise coming from those in the market, it was unlikely anyone would have overheard her. At least, he hoped it was unlikely. Where? He tried to follow where she was pointing. It wasn't easy to see exactly what Quinnigoff was trying to indicate. The shop was a fairly long way away on the far side of the market square, and there were so many people in the crowd blocking his view of those distant shops that what had caught Quinnigoff's attention only became visible for a fraction of a second once every so often. Then the crush of bodies once again obscured it from sight. From what little Reyes could see, there seemed to be a wide selection of sculptures on the pavement outside one of the shops. It was hard to make out much in the way of detail, but they appeared to be a selection of fairly large statues, some of which were as tall as those in the crowd, as well as a small scattering of busts, samples of what awaited the customer inside. Perhaps the shop had nothing to do with painting. Maybe it only catered to sculptors. It was even possible that the shop only sold sculptures and had nothing at all to do with the creative side. With so many people moving back and forth in front of the shop, it was hard for Reyes to make out any real detail. Nevertheless, he felt it was worth a closer look. "I want you two to wait here. I'll go and investigate further," Reyes ordered. He approached the edge of the building he was perched on. "But Chief," Quinnigoff protested. "I promise I won't be long," Reyes told her. He launched himself from the roof of the tool shop, unfurling his wings, and flew relatively low over the heads of the patrons of the market. No one paid him any mind here. In Golespon, harpies were an everyday occurrence. It wasn't just sculptures that had been placed in prominent view outside the shop. There were a few paintings as well, and for the most part these rested against the large glass windows of the shop and seemed almost to merge into the background. It was beginning to look very much like the sort of shop that only sold finished works of art, and not the materials that were used to produce them. Nevertheless, Reyes felt it was worth going inside the shop and checking it out thoroughly. Even if they couldn't supply him with a canvas, there was a chance they might know someone who could. "Hey, bird, we don't serve your kind here." The proprietor of the art shop commented the instant Reyes stepped past the impressively decorated doors into the store. He was a slightly rotund elf, an elf of advanced years, dressed in an apron that was intended to suggest to the customer that he himself was a sculptor. If only the apron didn't look so clean. The elf also had an angry look in his eyes. Reyes wouldn't have been surprised to learn that the elf had watched him land just outside the shop, and had been keeping an eye on him ever since. Reyes decided to ignore the elf for now. He was more interested in the layout of the shop. It was definitely the kind of shop that sold works of art rather than any actual supplies. There were some beautiful pieces of art on the shelves about the walls, and gorgeous sculptures lined either side of a narrow walkway from the door to the counter, with short, well thought out detours, so that patrons could access all corners of the shop. There was even a small section of the shop that had a display of cheap and tacky items, things that were ideal for the homes of those who wanted their friends to think they were cultured, but who couldn't afford to pay for something more expensive. Reyes had little doubt that though the cheap and tacky items occupied a very small part of the floor space, it was the sale of those items that would keep a shop like this in business. As it was, it didn't seem to be a popular shop. Despite all the bustling crowds outside the doors, Reyes was the only customer. "Didn't you hear me, bird?" the proprietor shouted. He reached under his counter and brought out a sculptor's mallet, which he brandished threateningly in Reyes' direction like a weapon. "I said, I don't serve your kind here." Reyes stared back at the proprietor and at the mallet the elf held, and was not impressed. Reyes was confident that if it should come to blows, the elf was going to come off worse. On the other hand, what would be the point in confrontation when the shop clearly didn't have what he needed? "Then I won't buy anything." "Good," the elf said suspiciously, keeping a firm grip on the mallet. "Then just turn around and head on back out the door." Reyes glanced quickly round at the door behind him. Then he looked back at the proprietor. "One question first. Where in the city can I buy a big canvas, a very big canvas, for painting? I'm talking about something really huge. The bigger the better." "Never heard of a bird wanting to paint before," the proprietor replied. He rested his hand with the mallet on top of the counter, but kept hold of it. "It's a gift," Reyes said quickly. "It's, for my mail." "Pah!" the proprietor voiced. "Lazy creatures. I've heard all about your mails. They seem to exist only for one purpose. I'm surprised he'd find the time to paint. Still, if it would get you out of my store, you might try the Centaur's Gift in the Northern Market." "The Centaur's Gift?" Reyes said in a doubtful tone. "The owner there will serve anyone," the elf said distastefully. "Thank you," Reyes intoned. "Just get out of here," the elf yelled. Reyes saw no point in hanging around any longer than he needed to. He stepped back across the threshold of the shop and returned to the bustling crowd. He was back in the air almost immediately and began to fly back across the market to the rooftop where he had left his 2 bodyguards. It was strange. He was sure that he should be able to see them perched on that roof waiting for him, but there seemed to be no sign of either of them. Reyes hoped nothing had happened to them.